And do you think that it's happening now in the United States, that we're slipping towards an autocracy?
Yes, I do, because the people want somebody to get control of this thing. And so what you see it yourself, we're now questioning, there's a challenge. How does the legal system work? Who has what rights? The possibility of if there was a not accepting an election result. These things are very real today.
That was the voice of billionaire investor Ray Dalio, answering a question that most of us are afraid to even ask. He's not just talking about an economic crisis anymore. He's warning that our national debt is becoming a national security threat, a threat to democracy itself. But how? How does red ink on a government ledger translate into a desire for a dictator? It's a process that history has shown us before, a dangerous equation where economic pain plus political failure can equal the end of freedom as we know it. In this video, we are going to dissect Dalio's most terrifying warning yet. We will show you the undeniable numbers that are pushing our country toward a cliff, explore the two historical blueprints, one that ended in disaster and one in success, and reveal the triad of risks that could unravel not just our economy, but our entire system of government. By the end of this journey, you will understand the fragile link between a nation's balance sheet and its freedom.
And what I'm seeing in politics is that there is, it's like being on a ship that's headed to rocks. And there are those who want to turn right and those who want to turn left. And they're so hell-bent on arguing of whether they turn right or left that they will not get past, they're going to hit the rocks.
Dalio's metaphor isn't poetry. It's a precise diagnosis of our political reality. And while the politicians argue, the ship's dashboard is flashing red. Let's look at the numbers. The U.S. federal deficit is currently running at about 6.4% of our entire economy, our GDP. To be stable, that number needs to be around 3%. That gap of more than 3% represents over $900 billion of unsustainable borrowing every single year. And the consequences of our past borrowing are catching up to us. The interest payments on our existing debt have now surpassed an almost unbelievable $1 trillion per year. That's more than the entire U.S. defense budget. It's $1 trillion that can't be spent on medical research, modern infrastructure, or education, because it's being burned just to pay the maintenance cost on past decisions. Even more alarmingly, in the next year alone, the U.S. government must refinance over $9 trillion in maturing debt. This means we are profoundly dependent on the day-to-day confidence of the global bond market to simply roll over our existing loans, making our entire financial system vulnerable to sudden shifts in investor sentiment. This is the definition of unsustainable. The question is not if we need to turn the ship, but how. And history gives us two very different blueprints for what happens next. A nation at a fiscal crossroads has a choice. To see the stakes, we have to look at two pivotal moments in history. First, the cautionary tale. In the 1930s, Germany's Weimar Republic was crushed by economic crisis, hyperinflation followed by the Great Depression. The democratic government, led by Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, responded with austerity policies, slashing spending and raising taxes in the middle of a depression, which only deepened the social suffering and drove desperate voters toward political extremes. The government seemed weak and incompetent. This created a vacuum. When a major bank collapsed in 1931, the fact it was led by a prominent Jewish banker was ruthlessly exploited by Nazi propaganda to give a tangible human face to an abstract economic fear. The public lost faith not just in the politicians, but in democracy itself. They began to crave a strong leader who could restore order, and Adolf Hitler promised to be that leader. The result was the death of democracy. Now, the roadmap for success. In the 1990s, America faced its own daunting deficits. But instead of collapsing, leaders from both parties forged a grand bargain. This was made possible by a shared commitment to fiscal discipline, enforced by procedural rules like the pay-as-you-go provision, which required new spending to be offset by savings elsewhere. They made difficult choices. In 1993, Democrats passed tax increases on corporations and high earners. In 1997, after years of partisan battle, Republicans led by Speaker Newt Gingrich and Democrats led by President Clinton reached a landmark bipartisan agreement, Republicans accepted the 1993 tax hikes, and in return, Democrats agreed to slow the growth of popular programs like Medicare.
It was cut by 5% of GDP. The budget deficit in those years was cut by 5% of GDP by spreading it around.
They prove that even in a polarized environment, it is possible to put the country's financial health ahead of partisan politics.
It has to be done by three things. There is, and it has to be spread out among these three things, because any one of those three things would be too painful. And those three things are tax revenue, spending cuts, and interest rates.
Dalio's solution is about balance. Think of it like a three-legged stool: taxes, spending, and interest rates. All three must work together. Weakening any one leg causes the entire system to collapse. But not everyone agrees this stool is even wobbly. Some economists, like Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, argue that the focus on debt is an imaginary crisis. He points out that the U.S. had a comparable debt-to-GDP ratio after World War II, which was followed by decades of growth that shrank the debt burden. Others, proponents of modern monetary theory, go even further. They argue that because the U.S. government issues its own currency, it can never truly run out of money to pay its debts. For them, the only real constraint on spending is inflation, not the deficit. While these are important academic debates, Dalio's warning is about the real world, where the confidence of global investors acts as a very real constraint. And it is the fear of a collapse and the political failure to address it that creates the fertile ground for a dangerous shift in the American mindset. One common myth is that the president can simply force the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low. In reality, the Fed is independent, and any attempt at political interference would be seen by the global bond market as a catastrophic loss of credibility, causing them to demand higher interest rates and making the crisis far worse. That is why the balanced three-legged stool approach, which earns the market's confidence, is so critical.
When you talk about perhaps we're moving into an autocracy, there's another sentence in your book that struck me, which is, as shown in history, the transfer of power from democracy to autocracy was more often than not orderly within the democracy because people were sick and tired of the system failing to work and wanted to give power to a leader who would take control of the mass and make it work well.
This is the final terrifying piece of the puzzle. The slide into autocracy doesn't have to be a violent coup. It can be a quiet procedural surrender. It begins when a free people facing a crisis their democracy seems incapable of solving decide that a strong leader is worth the price of their own power. This is what's truly at stake. The research calls it a triad of risks that we now face. First, a sovereign debt crisis where confidence in the U.S. government itself collapses. This would not be like 2008. It would be a crisis of the state itself, leading to a deep and prolonged depression. The loss of the dollar. The end of the dollar as a world's reserve currency. This exorbitant privilege allows America to borrow cheaply and project power. Its loss would be a historic blow to American prosperity and influence. And third, the ultimate political risk, an orderly transition to autocracy. This is the culmination of the crisis, where economic chaos, as seen in the 1930s, leads the public to accept an authoritarian alternative to restore order. So, what is the way out? The solution must be as big as the problem. Dalio suggests it requires a level of cooperation not seen in decades.
What my hope would be is that there's a mandatory bipartisan solution, that they create the equivalent of Manhattan projects and so on, and create a mandatory bipartisan way of dealing with that. Do I think that's likely? I don't think it's likely. I think that, but if we don't achieve a bipartisan situation, we're going to have a financial crisis and be fighting with each other. So hopefully the compelling nature of this, before we have a recession, which will make that situation worse.
The action plan is to demand our leaders stop the partisan warfare and forge a new grand bargain, a Manhattan Project for the national debt. It means a balanced plan where everyone contributes something. Modest spending cuts paired with modest tax increases. A solution built on shared sacrifice, not political victory. At the start of this video, Ray Dalio gave a chilling answer to a terrifying question. He explained that a nation's slide into autocracy doesn't begin with soldiers in the street, but with red ink on a balance sheet and paralysis in the halls of power. The ship of state is heading for the rocks. History has shown us the catastrophic cost of arguing over how to turn, and the profound rewards of turning together. The problem is still solvable. The choice is still ours.